They told Karoline Leavitt this was a friendly return appearance, just a conversation, nothing more. The invitation came from Jon Stewart himself. He wanted to discuss national renewal, unity, and political division. Ratings were stable, the vibe was light. No conflict. That was the promise. Karoline arrived in the studio wearing a crisp white blouse and calm confidence. She shook hands with stage crew, greeted the director, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the stage. The audience applauded politely. Jon Stewart stood, smiling. Jon said, "Karoline Leavitt, welcome back. It's been a while. We invited you back to hear what you think has changed in America since your last appearance, because we know a lot has." Karoline smiled and said, "Thank you, Jon. I'm glad to be here. America's changed. We're waking up. We're speaking up. And we're tired of being told to stay quiet." Jon leaned forward and said, "Waking up from what, exactly?" Karoline said, "From the idea that someone else knows better. From being told what to think. From a culture that celebrates outrage over solutions." Jon said, "So where does that leave us now? A country fed up with messaging and posturing." Karoline said, "It leaves us at a crossroads. We can keep screaming at each other, or pausing and acting." The audience murmured softly. Jon smiled. He said, "Karoline, you're not someone who's shy about provocation. You tell it like it is. But how do you balance that with nuance?" Karoline said, "Nuance doesn't mean silence." Jon said, "Fair. But strong rhetoric can deepen division. How do you know when you're tearing down and when you're building up?" Karoline straightened and said, "I build. I don't tear. But building doesn't happen on soft ground." Jon said, "Tell me how." Karoline said, "By telling the truth. Not what someone wants to hear." The audience leaned in. Jon said, "All right. Let's dive deeper. I want to ask about the culture wars. How much of this is fear and how much is leadership?" Karoline said matter-of-factly, "It's less about fear, more about control. And leadership requires giving people back their choices." Jon said, "Sounds simple. But choices have consequences." Karoline said, "Yes, but consequences are different when people make informed choices." Jon paused. He said, "So let's try a hot topic, critical race theory. School boards. It's become a flashpoint. Your views?" Karoline took a breath and said, "Parents deserve to know what's taught in schools. That's accountability, not censorship." Jon said, "Understood. But what about teachers concerned about accuracy and fairness?" Karoline said, "Then open the books. Let the teachers make their case. But don't shut down the conversation." The audience murmured again. Jon said, "It sounds like you're asking America to grow up, to engage, to debate. Hard." Karoline said, "Exactly. We need to grow up, not grow quiet." Jon's expression shifted. He offered a nod. He said, "That brings me to my next point. Your critics say your message is incomplete. That shouting facts at people isn't the same as listening to where they're coming from." Karoline said, "Facts matter more than feelings." Jon shook his head slightly. He said, "But people feel what they feel, and feelings drive action." Karoline said, "I get that. But feelings based on misinformation lead to broken policy." Jon leaned back. He said, "So, what's your call to action?" Karoline leaned forward. She said, "Grow up. Check your sources, question your leaders, and hold yourself accountable." A beat. Jon looked at her carefully. He said, "That's simple and harsh." Karoline said, "It's honest." Jon paused. He said, "So what happens now? Do we grow up? Or do we keep shouting?" The audience exhaled. Jon said, "We'll find out after the break." The lights dimmed. Karoline sat back. Her eyes stayed on Jon. That silence said more than any words could. The lights brightened again and the audience settled, still holding their breath. Jon Stewart leaned forward, voice calm but probing. He said, "Karoline, we said grow up. But growth demands change on both sides. Can you say where you have changed?" Karoline paused, looking thoughtful. She said, "I've always believed in accountability. But I learned that accountability isn't just holding others to truth. It's owning your own mistakes when they happen. Jon said, "That's rare. What mistake are you owning tonight?" Karoline looked directly at him. She said, "I've dismissed people too quickly, assumed I was right without understanding their perspective. I've learned that dialogue requires listening, not just speaking." The audience murmured in approval. Jon nodded slowly. He said, "That shift matters. But talk is easy. Show me how that plays out in policy or public life." Karoline said, "It starts by supporting leaders who admit their mistakes, by backing reforms, not just rhetoric, by demanding that we do more than tweet, we govern." Jon said, "Tweeting and governing. Two very different things. You've praised conservative leaders for transparency, yet many say they've been anything but. How do you reconcile that?" Karoline said firmly, "Transparency isn't choosing sides. It's choosing truth. If someone lies to protect power, that's not leadership." Jon glanced to the audience, then back. He said, "So when leaders espouse transparency, they should be held accountable, even if they share your views?" Karoline said, "Yes. Yes, they should. Accountability doesn't stop at agreement." Jon leaned back and said, "Now we're getting somewhere. Let's talk media. You've been critical of the mainstream press. Some say you reject facts that don't fit your narrative. Is that fair?" Karoline replied steadily, "Not if the facts are vetted. I reject the spin. I reject headlines that don't speak to real people's lives." Jon said, "So real people's lives matter more than what elite outlets report?" Karoline said, "Yes. I want reporters to go into towns and ask what's real, what's happening in kitchens, hospitals, schools, not just political talk shows." Jon smiled slowly. He said, "We're drifting out of politics into civics now. I can respect that." Karoline said, "That's good." Jon said, "But when civics becomes a political credential, when civics becomes ideology masked as virtue, what then?" Karoline said, "Then we've lost civics. We've turned solutions into slogans." The audience felt the shift. The questions were no longer rhetorical, they were urgent. Jon said softly, "This exchange was supposed to be a friendly comeback, but it's becoming something else." Karoline said, "That's because friends sometimes have to have hard talks." A beat passed. Jon said, "Let me press you one more time, because this is where the tension lives. You say grow up. You want us to stop shouting at each other, but you also say you want action now. How do we balance justice with urgency?" Karoline took a breath. She said, "We grow up by accepting that justice isn't an event, it's a process. And urgency doesn't mean skipping the process. It means speeding it up." Jon said, "Speeding up a process that's slow by nature?" Karoline said, "Yes. Reform courts, mental health systems, campaign finance. Make the institutions work faster and more fairly. Keep the guardrails, just don't let them be roadblocks." Jon's expression softened. He said, "That sounds a lot like policy. It also sounds like hope." Karoline said, "That's why we show up, to offer hope that comes with responsibility." Jon said quietly, "Show me a time when hope hurt us." Karoline looked down for a moment. She said, "When hope becomes an excuse to delay real solutions, when promises are used to quiet pain, that hurts more than cynicism." There was a tension that needed resolution. Jon said, "We're near the end of the show. Can we land this?" Karoline nodded. She said, "Grow up isn't an insult. It's a call. To speak truth. To listen. To act." Jon said, "And to whom is that call directed?" Karoline said, "To all of us. Nobody gets off the hook." Jon exhaled. He said, "That's heavy, but it feels honest." Karoline said, "Honesty is heavier than headlines." The audience exhaled behind them. Jon looked at her again. He said, "We're going to take one last break. When we come back, maybe we'll find a way forward together." Lights dimmed and the audience clapped, tentatively, as if not quite sure what they'd agreed to. Karoline remained standing, still, her gaze fixed on Jon. The lights came back on, and the audience grew quiet. Jon Stewart leaned forward as the applause faded. He said, "Karoline, we talked about growing up, about accountability, about hope weighed against urgency. It's rare on this stage. What now?" Karoline took a steady breath. She said, "Now we do something. We leave here, and we stop letting division distract us from solutions." Jon nodded and said, "Solutions? You outlined some. Faster courts, campaign finance reform, mental health access. That would take cooperation across aisles. Are you ready for that kind of fight?" Karoline said, "More than ready. I've spent my life believing that change isn't just a transcript. It's a compromise built on conviction." Jon said, "Conviction without compromise is just rigidity." Karoline said, "And compromise without conviction is just surrender." Jon paused. He said, "So how do we carry this forward? What's the first step?" Karoline said, "We start here, by holding media, leaders, and ourselves to the standard we're talking about." Jon said, "Easy to say, hard to do." Karoline said, "It is. But no harder than fighting wars where no one wins." A moment passed. Jon said, "You came here prepared. You spoke with clarity, even when it tested us." Karoline said, "I wanted honesty, not comfort." Jon looked at the audience. He said, "Maybe that's what growing up looks like. Less applause, more awkward moments." Karoline said, "I'd take awkward every time over empty approval." The audience slowly applauded. Jon said, "This might be the most intense return guest moment in my show's history." Karoline said softly, "Better intense than invisible." Jon smiled, nodding. He said, "So what's next for you, Karoline?" Karoline said, "I'm going back to the people, to the places that rarely make headlines, to start doing the work we've been talking about." Jon said, "And when you do that, can we say you grew up?" Karoline looked into her hands. She said, "No, I'll say we did." Jon said, "Because it takes more than one person to grow up." Karoline said, "I know." Jon said, "Let's end with this. Are you asking America to grow up?" Karoline said, "Yes, because we're only as strong as the actions we refuse to defer." Jon closed his eyes for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Karoline. This was real. Thank you." Karoline paused, then nodded once. She said, "Thank you, Jon." Jon turned to the camera. He said, "Good night. Think about growth. And then start." The audience erupted in applause, full and genuine. Karoline left the stage quietly. Jon watched her walk off. A lesson learned on both sides. This is the USA Liberty. If you're ready to grow up, speak truth, and do the work, subscribe today. Because it's easy to be loud. It's harder to be honest. And it's most powerful to be both.